Hello and welcome to another Mr. Carter Science Special. In this video we'll be looking at natural selection. Now natural selection is very closely linked in with evolution, and if you put these words together into a sentence you can form a very good workable GCSE definition of evolution. Evolution is the gradual change of one species into another species over time. Now, the mechanism how this happens is by one of two processes, either natural selection or selective breeding. If you go on to study biology at A level or at university level, this definition of evolution will be built upon and improved to discuss ideas such as changes in allele frequency. However, at GCSE level, this is a very good working definition. Now, Charles Darwin often referred to his ideas as the survival of the fittest, but that word fit has changed over the last 200 years, so nowadays scientists prefer to discuss the idea of the best adapted. So the theory of evolution by natural selection states that all species of living things have evolved from simple life forms that first developed more than 3 billion years ago, and you can see that in this BBC poster down at the bottom there. So there is variation in any population. In my previous video on variation, we discussed that variation is caused by either the genes that you are born with or the effect of the environment on your phenotype, on your characteristics as you grow and develop. So any population will always have variation in the individuals within that species. And when the environment changes, those individuals who possess alleles, genes, that give you a slight advantage will be able to survive longer and breed more and pass on those successful alleles to the next generation. Over time, the successful alleles will become more common in the population, and there will be a gradual change in the characteristics of the population. For example, your average height may well change slowly over 100,000 years or perhaps 1,000,000 years, so that your height increases to a point where you may well decide that we have a different species compared to the species 1,000,000 years ago. Now, if two species become so different that they can no longer interbreed and produce fertile offspring, they will have formed two new species. This is our definition of a species down here. A species is a group of organisms that are so similar that they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. If that no longer happens, then you have had a split and one species has become two species. Now, the evidence for evolution by natural selection comes from two areas. One, the fossil record, because we can't look to the future, but we can look in the past and see how species have changed going backwards. Some of the best evidence or most complete fossil record comes from the horse, and you can see that here, how we going backwards in time. Gradually the foot of the horse has changed over approximately 60 million years. But it's important to remember, in terms of evolution, don't think of ladders, think of bushes. This is not one straight change from the past to the present. In fact, if you look at this diagram down here, you can see that actually we had many common ancestors branching to give rise to a number of many different similar horse type species over that 60 million year period. And in fact, it's only really one branch that has survived into the modern horse as we would know it. So the fossil record is very important in providing evidence into evolution by natural selection, but more recently we've been able to utilize genetic studies which have confirmed much of the science of evolution. So how exactly does natural selection lead to evolution? Well, there's a series of basic steps, and I'm going to run through these steps, and then I'm going to show you how you can utilize these steps to write a simple short paragraph which will get you 6 marks on any natural selection question in your exam. So the very first thing, which is often stated in the question, will be environmental change. The environment of the world of an ecosystem is not stable, and it can change both locally and globally. As we've already stated, every single population will have variation caused by genes or the environment, and this variation will allow natural selection to occur. The next step is that we have overproduction. More living young are born than will be able to survive into adulthood, and that leads to competition. Organisms will compete for things like food and shelter and mates, both with members of your own species and with members of other species. The main idea of all of this is that because of a variation, some individuals will have an advantage. They will have a characteristic that gives them an advantage and helps them to survive just slightly better compared to other individuals in their species. And if you can survive long enough, then you're more likely to become an adult and you're more likely to be able to breed. And that leads us to survive and breed. And if you can breed, then you can pass on those alleles, the genes, to your offspring that will give them the advantages that you had. So over time, more of the next generation will have more of this advantage, more of this useful feature, and this will lead to a gradual change. If the environment stays the same now, then even more of the future generations going forward in time will have more and more of this useful feature. The best example of this, and the simplest example of this, is the evolution of the giraffe. If you go backwards in time approximately 16 million years ago, there was a very similar species to a giraffe. It was not a giraffe, but it was similar. Its neck wasn't long enough for us to be able to classify it as a giraffe. But around the same time, due to a change in environment, the trees on the African savanna were able to grow taller because there was more rain. And therefore, we are able to have that change of environment and natural selection occurring. Now, if you pause the video at this point and read the paragraph below and see if you can insert these words into the gaps so that you can be able to describe how natural selection allowed the evolution of the giraffe. So this is the full paragraph. Trees on the African savanna got taller. There is more variation in the population of giraffes. Some have longer necks and some will have shorter necks. Giraffes with longer necks will have an advantage over the giraffes with the shorter necks. Therefore, they can reach more leaves and eat more leaves, so they're more likely to survive, breed, and pass on the genes, the alleles, for longer necks to their offspring. And then the genes or the alleles for longer necks will have become more common, and more giraffes will have longer necks. And if this process continues over millions of years, then you will have gone from a species with a relatively short neck to a species with a relatively long neck. And one of the really interesting facts about giraffes is that they haven't increased the number of bones in their neck. It's just that each individual bone has got slightly larger over many generations and millions of years. Now, if you look at this paragraph closely, and I'm going to show you 3 other examples on this video, you'll notice the same things keep coming up time and time again. We always begin with the environmental change, then we discuss variation, then, and this is the only difficult part of the whole exercise, you have to work out what the advantage is going to be. Each different example will give you a different advantage. Once you've identified the advantage, you state that the individuals with that advantage are more likely to survive, breed, and pass on those alleles for that advantage to the next generation. And therefore, those genes or alleles will become more common in that next generation. And by that way, we should be able to easily get all 6 marks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So we're going to use that basic format now to look at 3 other examples of natural selection, and hopefully you're writing these example paragraphs down so that you can get the feel for how they are, how they work, and how they're basically all the same apart from different examples will have different advantages. So in this next example, we're going to be talking about oysters. You may know about oysters because they have pearls inside. but oysters are a common food source around the world. And in this case, we're talking about a place called Malapet Bay near Princess Island in Canada, where they have data on the oyster harvest, how many barrels of oysters are collected from the sea each year, going back over 100 years. In this case, we're going to be looking at the data from 1915 until 1945. So in 1915, fishermen began to notice a small number of diseased oysters. And you can see in 1915, we've got approximately 4,000 barrels of oysters being landed a year, being harvested a year. This disease symptoms, they included a small size, a flabby feel, and pus-filled blisters within the muscle of the oysters. Soon, almost the whole oyster population had been destroyed by the disease, and you can see that if we go down to here by 1920, we're down to less than 500 barrels of oysters, whereas previously we were getting 4,000. But a small number of oysters had the allele, or another way of saying that is had the gene. An allele, remember, is a form of a gene, which gave them resistance to the disease. And by 1935, oyster harvesting was again possible, and by 1940 the population was the same size as it was in 1915. We was being able to harvest that 4,000 barrels of oysters again. So how had this oyster population survived? Well, the answer is natural selection. We have to think again about that paragraph. We always begin with the environmental change, which in this case was the new disease that killed the oysters. And we're going to find the same words in this paragraph. So pause the video now, write this down and see whether you can answer this question correctly to collect all 6 marks. How had natural selection allowed the oyster population to survive? So, as we've already said, we get the new disease killing off the oysters, and there is variation within our oyster population. That means some oysters will contain and have an allele or a gene which gives them disease resistance. The oysters with this allele will have an advantage over oysters without the disease resistance allele. They are more likely to survive, breed, and then pass on this allele to the next generation. The disease-resistant allele then becomes more and more common within the population, and over time, most of the oysters will carry this disease-resistant allele because therefore the gene pool has altered, or we've had a shift in the allele frequency of the population. But ultimately, if you've got this allele, you can survive and breed, and therefore your children are more likely to have the allele, and your grandchildren, and so on and so on. And the entire species has therefore adapted to a change in the environment by natural selection. Now, this has only happened from 1915 to 1945, over approximately 30 years. But if these changes can add up again and again and again over millions of years, they can and do lead to the formation of new species. So let's take a look at another modern example of natural selection. And in this case, we're going to look at the evolution of antibiotic resistant bacteria. And a big example of that is a bacteria known as MRSA. A little bit of background first. Antibiotics destroy bacteria and stop them from growing. So if you had an agar plate of bacteria growing and you placed in an antibiotic disc within there, then you might start to identify around that disc that there is an area here, a zone of no growth, because the bacteria has not been able to grow where the antibiotic chemical is present. So antibiotics like penicillin are made naturally by molds and fungi, but we are now using them within medicine, and for the last, since the 1940s and 50s really, we have been overusing them to treat bacterial diseases. So a classic example of this is the Staphylococcus aureus, or SA for short, bacteria, Staphylococcus aureus, and you can see the cells of that as shown here underneath a microscope. Now, this bacteria is harmless if you have a strong immune system. In fact, most of you will have Staphylococcus aureus on your skin. It tends to live around the entrance to your nose and other holes within and around your body. However, if this bacteria can get inside your body, into the muscle tissues, into the blood, into the organ tissues, then the bacteria begins to produce a toxin. And this toxin, in effect, destroys the glue that holds your skin onto your muscle, and it destroys those glue that holds your muscle onto your bones. So in effect, your skin begins to peel off, and then your muscle begins to fall off, exposing your bones underneath. It's an incredibly painful and unpleasant disease. However, you can take antibiotics. Antibiotics will help and they will destroy the bacteria, and therefore you will be able to survive this disease, no problems. As I say, in the young, it tends to be not a problem. If you're a normal, healthy person, then your immune system is strong, then your immune system will be able to deal with this bacteria without any problems. But in the extremely young or the old, it is a big problem and it can kill you. However, overuse of antibiotics has led to a major problem. So if you consider that this here, this single cell, is one Staphylococcus aureus cell. Bacteria reproduce incredibly rapidly, so 20 minutes later this one cell will become 2, which becomes 4, which becomes 8, 16 and so on. But you can notice in this little demonstration, this graphic, that I've introduced colours. And this is to show that due to sort of mutations in the DNA, we are going to get variation within the population of this bacteria. So I've shown that by using different colours. And once you get variation, then you can have natural selection, but only if the environment changes. And how do we change the environment? Well, doctors have been overprescribing antibiotics, such as the antibiotic methicillin. Now, antibiotics, as we previously mentioned, destroy bacteria. So if we give our patient this antibiotic, it's going to destroy all the bacteria within this population. And there we go. All gone, except one. This one bacteria has an advantage. It must have had an allele which allows it to be resistant to the methicillin antibiotic. Therefore, it's not killed by the methicillin antibiotic. In fact, this one bacteria can now grow on to survive and reproduce. And of course, all its offspring will now have the same alleles which provide resistance to the methicillin antibiotic. So now we have an entire population of methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus bacteria. And they have evolved by natural selection. So how could we describe all of that in order to get ourselves our 6 marks in an exam question? Well, pause the video, try and write down this paragraph, and you might notice it's very similar to the other paragraphs we've mentioned in this video so far. So here's the answer. Doctors give out too many antibiotics, so we get an environmental change in the environment that the bacteria live in. There is variation in the bacteria population. Bacteria that are not killed by the antibiotics will have an advantage over bacteria which are killed by the antibiotics. They are more likely to survive, more likely to breed and pass on those alleles for the antibiotic resistance to their offspring. And over time, these alleles become more common in the population. This is and still is a growing issue around the world. And in particular, these antibiotic resistant bacteria species are spread when doctors and nurses and patients and visitors do not wash their hands when in a hospital, when moving between patients and between wards. So the final example that I'm going to give you on how to write a good paragraph to describe natural selection, and again get those 6 marks, is all to do with rats. Now, rats in many major cities are a major health problem and a major concern. So in the 1950s, a poison called warfarin was developed. in order for you to kill rats that may be infesting your work or your home. All you had to do was put down these little pellets, the rats would come and eat them, and then the rats would die. However, 60 years later, this poison is not very useful at all. It does not work. Why? Because of natural selection. The rats have evolved by natural selection to become resistant to this poison. Again, pause the video, see if you can write a paragraph to explain how that occurred. So here's the answer. The environment changed. People started using a rat poison called warfarin. Within the rat population, there is natural variation. Some rats were resistant to warfarin. Rats who are resistant had an advantage over the rats who were not resistant. Therefore, they were more likely to survive and breed and pass on those alleles for resistance to their offspring. Over time, most rats will have the allele for resistance, and this is an example of natural selection. Now, one little extra piece of information that's very interesting is that those rats with resistance to warfarin tended to be smaller rats. And when people stopped using warfarin, those rats no longer had that advantage. In fact, the bigger rats had the advantage because they were bigger, stronger, able to get more food, and therefore more likely to survive and breed. So now warfarin resistance within rat populations is beginning to decrease again because the environment has changed again. In terms of evolution, natural selection, there is no end point and there is no fixed point. It is only how species will either adapt to an environmental change, or if they're unable to adapt to an environmental change, they will become extinct. I hope you've enjoyed this video on natural selection. If you have, don't forget to like and subscribe and drop me a comment below. Let me know what you've learnt. Thank you very much for your time.